So, welcome to this discussion on police brutality in the context of COVID-19 and South Africa's lockdown. This is one of a series of discussions that will be hosted by The Forge. And so we'll be having this fantastic discussion with two very interesting people. My name is Thato Masiangoako. I'm a researcher from the Socioeconomic Rights Institute. And today we'll be speaking with Elisha Kunene and Daneel Knoetze. Elisha is a candidate attorney in the Land Rights Department at Richard Spoor Inc. Attorneys. And he's a former legal researcher at the Constitutional Court of South Africa and the Supreme Court of Seychelles. He may be well known for his various contributions to various platforms such as Daily Maverick. And he also contributes and is, I think, partly the creator of a podcast called Just Us Under a Tree. Daneel Knoetze is an investigative journalist and editor at Viewfinder. He writes for other places as well, I think. But he investigates police brutality and the failure of police oversight mechanisms in South Africa. He's the creator of the documentary A Killing in the Wine Fields, in the Winelands. A Killing in the Winelands. Following the police response to a farm worker strike in Witwatersrand back in 2012, in the days after the Marikana massacre. So, I want to begin this discussion, perhaps with you, Elisha, because you wrote a story, well, you put out a thread, which you then wrote about, and your thread basically detailed your horrific encounter with private security and the police. As they were basically enforcing the lockdown on, I think it was either the first or second days, in the early days of the lockdown. Could you perhaps, with this experience in mind, speak to how to historically establish modes of law enforcement further damage communities that they're supposed to be there for and that they're supposed to serve? Can you speak to that?
Sure. Historical modes of policing. So just briefly, what happened with us was that we live on what's normally quite a busy neighborhood. Lots of shops. It's a commercial district primarily. So of course, as soon as the lockdown was announced, all of those places shut down and the place became pretty much empty, except for the people who have nowhere to go, and that's mostly the homeless people or the people who would work as car guards. And so we've been concerned about that, because quite a few live directly on our street, and there was not all that much information. So we were towards the front of our residence observing as a group of 10 to 15 people who were primarily police officers, but some private security contractors as well, were, as far as we could tell, like harassing a homeless person who lives on our street, telling him that he should disappear, and if they find him out there again, they'll burn his property, like silently observing from our gate. And it's at that time that they turned their attention to us, came across the road, demanded we allow them into the place, intimidated us, humiliated us, conducted an unlawful search of the whole residence. And that was quite shocking, of course, because one of them like threatened physically to harm me. I'm not going to repeat the same words. But I think what that revealed, and of course we were lucky no one was physically assaulted, is that what I think is a historically consistent manner of policing is that viewing their role as to like scare people into submission. So sort of like where you as the community never feel like the subject that they're protecting, but that you feel as though they're protecting other people from you, and that you're the person who has to be scared into compliance, and you feel like you're viewed in suspicion. I couldn't find any reason, pretextual or not, that it would be necessary for them to invade our privacy in that way, for them to scare us in that way, except for viewing us through that lens of suspicion. The only thing which is a coherent answer would be that if somehow they profiled us and like, why are you here? Just two young black men. I've been locked down with just my brother, who you might see moving up and down. And so it is just that sort of antagonism and that sort of suspicion, which had meant that they were angry because there was like alcohol in the house. And so, which is to say that if they had found us and we were inebriated, or if they found something which was to their dissatisfaction, then it would have justified whatever amount of aggression they wanted to apply against us, because primarily they view themselves as being responsible for bringing that force and that aggressive force against like wrongdoers, and we in some way fitted the profile in that sort of way, and so that breaks down trust. It means that they're not in a position where we're going to call them. They can't protect the very homeless people we were concerned about. And it's more antagonistic than it would be like protective or productive in any way. So that's quite unfortunate.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Daneel, I want to bring you in here because Elisha is a lawyer. And if I'm not incorrect, he lives in a pretty well-off area, so to speak. And so I want you to perhaps speak to what many other people across the country have been experiencing, perhaps in informal settlements, in townships, where they are not legal professionals, so to speak, and don't have access to means of really holding the police accountable. Yeah.
Thank you, Thato. Thank you for having me, everyone. So yeah, just as I was listening to Ellie's recounting of what happened, you know, it's even though it's a well-to-do area, I think it's very telling that the police were enforcing lockdown regulations on poor working class people that frequent the area. That is a trend that I don't think anybody would be surprised, and it's borne out by the data. And what we know about policing in South Africa is that poor communities often that challenge the status quo or the state's authority, are often subject to extreme and excessive uses of force by the police. And that they not only that are they subjected to it more often, but I think their avenues for reporting and for holding the police accountable, whether it be in their own communities or in a broader, more systemic sense of working class communities across South Africa, is hampered and curtailed by the fact that the avenues are inaccessible often. And I think that is something that we've seen aggravated during lockdown, where the Independent Police Investigative Directorate has evidently not been accessible, has not been monitoring the situation actively enough in terms of what we saw from the data that they published in the first week, where they were only investigating, I think, 6 assault cases around the entire country, when we know that there was this sense in many communities, especially in the metropoles and in the working class areas and townships and informal settlements around the metropoles, but also police backing up anti-land invasion units, evicting people, that there was a definite sense of a scourge taking place in that first few days of hard lockdown enforcement. I must just add, what we saw during lockdown is not extraordinary. The circumstances might be extraordinary, but I think the levels and the impunity of the abuse is something that South Africans, especially working class South Africans, sit with, deal with every weekend, every week of their lives. It is a residue of a culture that was forged in apartheid era policing, and it is a consequence of a lack of oversight and a failure of accountability mechanisms, and indeed a failure of police management, command and control, to ensure that the ranks under them are disciplined in conducting, whether it be ordinary visible policing in poor communities or lockdown enforcement during this unprecedented time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daneel. A question for both of you, perhaps. So we've spoken a bit about the history, at least in terms of, you know, what's been inherited from the apartheid era. But I want to perhaps speak to newer developments, and by new I mean post-94 elements that have sort of shaped the kind of policing that we're seeing today, and perhaps even under the specific context of lockdown. Could you both perhaps speak to some of the statements that the Minister of Police has made? So in his context, he says some things that would perhaps be classified as quite inflammatory and encouraging criminality within the police service. And then on the part of the Minister of Defense, we see that, you know, she's very clear about the fact that law enforcement need to operate within the confines of the law, but at the same time, you know, goes on to say things like, you know, the public should not be provoking law enforcement during this time. So could you both perhaps speak to what the impact of this double speak is on the officers on the ground, and perhaps any other reasons why we're seeing this kind of brutality during lockdown, especially when people are not able to move around and defend themselves in other more conventional ways, like, you know, opening a case effectively, getting legal representation effectively, and even that is quite a limited number of people in the country that can even do that. So I'll begin with you, Elisha, and then Daneel, you can jump in.
Sure. So I think, as Daneel pointed out, is that this isn't new in the sense that the culture of unaccountability is one which has existed quite a while. So it's not an increase. But well, one thing which is quite scary is numbers stay quite consistent. So, like, this is not a new phenomenon in terms of police brutality and instances of misconduct, but that should be quite scary in the instance where the overwhelming majority of South Africans are locked in their homes, that they're still managing to find people to kill. But the reason that it's something which isn't new is because the culture, which goes straight from apartheid, but I think even in the democratic era, is the way that the police have been used to respond to sort of like suppressing like whatever is viewed as disorder, almost as if they were like a counterinsurgency force. If you're a disturbance, if there's protests, be it service delivery protests, be it students protesting at universities, be it people who are viewed as presenting a problem in terms of like crime and safety, then the police view their role as a sort of force which needs to flatten what is making uncomfortable those who are like entrenched or empowered in a specific space. And so calling the police hasn't ever been something which is the civic responsibility where you are engaging with your civil servants. It's been setting the dogs on troublemakers. And the thing which is surprising, so you mentioned that a lot of this comes directly from the Minister of Police, who's quite an enthusiastic autocrat in the way that he's been speaking and tweeting. And they've just been like going around the country on like road shows where they're celebrating, found you contravening lockdown, lock this person up, impound their vehicle. And then boasting about that and being like zero tolerance. But it's not just the Minister of the Police and the Minister of Defense, it's also the entire government has had this approach which says the rule of law is now effectively the might of like the security forces and security services. And so the statements which the South African police services have put out and the watchdogs have been that if you just comply and if you don't break down the lockdown regulations, then nothing will go wrong and they will have no reason to use excessive force on you. And this is the thing where I've seen quite a remarkable cognitive dissonance, where people are prepared to believe this idea that surely if something goes wrong, you must have provoked the police, or surely it's only provocation or some sort of wrongdoing which can invite their force and which can invite their ire. But that's been the government line of saying, as long as people stay in line, we're not aware of anything going outside of that. We're not aware of people doing anything wrong. Just behave yourself. Don't say nothing. Won't be nothing. And that's just not that's not the reality that we've seen. That's not the culture. That's not the reputation the police or armed forces in South Africa deserve. And what I think effectively is it's a gamble by the state, which says that because we have this pandemic, if we can get ahead of it and we can solve it in time, then we never have to admit to the police doing anything wrong, which is why you don't see any accountability, because hopefully we can lift the lockdown in time. But as was announced about a week ago, there was an increase of 70,000 members of the armed forces which are on patrol. So there is quite a significant risk of further abuses, which I think does need addressing directly, but there hasn't been quite enough open conversation about that. And I think that stems through all branches of government and not just the SAPS as an institution.
Daneel, do you want to jump in as well? And perhaps even when you do jump in, could you speak to what I would probably argue is a lack of clarity in terms of what the regulations are. So even in some of the cases, some of the reported cases that we've seen of abuse, people are being beaten because they were in their yards and not in their actual houses. And in other cases, people are being stopped, apprehended, and harassed because they're going to buy groceries, which, as far as we understand, in terms of the lockdown regulations, those are not violations of lockdown regulations. So when you speak to that, could you just reflect on perhaps a lack of clarity around what the regulations are on the part of the security forces?
Thanks, Thato. I'll return to that point just in a moment. I wanted to just pick up on Cele's utterances and police leadership. So I think it's important for us to understand that in spite of the sense that there are a few bad apples going around in police uniforms abusing people, that this is actually a fairly strict organization, one with very deep traditions, one where members have a genuine reverence for hierarchy and for the example that the leadership and the chain of command and the police set for, and the impact that that has on conduct in the lower ranks in the visible policing. So I think it's no historical secret that both as police commissioner and as police minister, Becky Cele has championed a show of force by the police service, especially in the rhetoric of fighting crime. But that often has the consequences of blurring the lines of who's considered a criminal and who's not. And I think this touches on your point of the regulations. There seems to have been a pervasive rendering by the police of people seen outdoors during the lockdown, that there was an automatic assumption that regulations were being contravened. And in a rhetoric and an environment where criminals are fair game for the use of force, individuals who are perceived as criminals during the extraordinary restrictions that have been put on people during lockdown, even though there are exceptions to that, as you've mentioned, essential services and purchasing of groceries. I think some of us will recall the man who was shot with rubber bullets and interviewed by E! News on the first weekend because it was the end of the month and he needed to get to the bank to pay his rent. You know, so that is an absolutely essential task that the individual was partaking in. So there are 2 points, that leadership really has an influence. And just on that point as well, during the era of state capture, we've seen criminality manifest in the higher ranks of the police service in the form of corruption, fraud, racketeering, and that, even though we don't see the same levels of assault directly by higher management of police, the air of impunity that something like corruption through the ranks of a institution like the police garners translates very readily into violence at the lower ranks where visible policing occurs. Thato, I'll stop before I waffle, and I would ask you to prompt us again.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you. Those are both fantastic contributions. I want to perhaps look ahead. What can people do during this time when we are seeing the kinds of abuses that we're seeing? We know Elisha was assaulted, or not assaulted, but obviously had a run-in, a violent run-in, because he was observing. And a lot of people, I think, have reported, having been assaulted because they were recording and monitoring and observing the conduct of law enforcement during their bouts of abuse. So what can people practically do, bearing in mind the risks, and what can civil society do to sort of hold the police accountable? It's a massive question. But even, you could probably answer that bearing in mind, what's possible in the short term, perhaps medium and long term. We'll go back to Elisha and then Daneel.
I'll try not to ramble too much. I think first on a personal level, for people who are not lawyers, I think it's very important that people still feel active, that people are aware that they still have their rights in terms of the Constitution. There's no such thing as lockdown or state of disaster, meaning that people don't have their rights. It's just that the regulations outlaw the very specific tasks for a very specific purpose. So people should still be active citizens as far as possible. That means that when something happens to you, you should report it. You should be calling. You should be spreading the news as much as possible, and you should be asking for help. As you're aware, I think you work for one of the organizations, the civil society organizations, which does have a helpline. So people should actively start asking the question, where can I get legal help? Which organizations are still important? Who do I call? Even myself being a lawyer, within the first week, I learned so much and had to spend so much time on the phone, because you would think a certain hotline is able to assist you, but they're not. So you think, but they're not, and being referred to the right places, so there's a record of this. I think at a more secondary level, for those people who do have specific access to resources or specific skills, is that I was quite disappointed is that, again, so SERI is one of the organizations which has applied to be a friend of the court in the Kosa matter, where the army has killed a person, and they're asking for very specific measures, including that there should be a code of conduct which is transparent. So everything Daneel speaks about, that there's impunity, I think people will often speak about impunity in the way of corruption, but sometimes there are like systematic things which like feed into the impunity. Like for the longest time, the parliamentary oversight bodies were closed, and it was civil society pressure which got those to open. When the feedback of your government is that we're not aware of any instance of police brutality, you should stand on the tables and shout you're lying, and try to put as much pressure as possible to get them to respond. I think that's the biggest thing that needs to come from civil society. I think I've been worried by what I feel is a massive dereliction of the duty of civil society to hold the state accountable, to question the information that they get, to resist things like, why do you need 70,000 additional members of the armed forces to support the police? What does that even mean? And in instances where abuses do go wrong, and you have people like Daneel who are paying particular attention to policing work, then consume that work. Take the time to read it, take the time to have the regulations and share it in your networks with anybody you can, and ask the questions. So effectively be an active citizen. Do the opposite of the idea that lockdown means get out of the government's way, the opposite of the idea that just trust the government to be able to do what they know is best, because our democracy, it can only work if people are active citizens and they gather as much information as they can, and they feed it up to make sure that those who do have the power to keep the organization disciplined are taking human rights into consideration and not just this need to respond to the threat. Yeah.
Thanks. Daneel, do you want to come in as well?
Sure, yeah, just to build off what Eli has said, and also to give kudos to the work Eli did in terms of monitoring in real time abuses that were happening. I think that has been one of the really encouraging outcomes of the lockdown. Not only has there been a captive audience at home, but there have been proactive monitoring, recording, and publicizing of individual abuses. I think that is incredibly important for us to get the visceral sense that these numbers, the jargon, it actually manifests in real consequences, physical consequences for people, and often people that don't have recourse to be able to see justice done and to hold police officers in their areas accountable. So that has been really encouraging. It's important for people to realize that they have every right within the Constitution and within the police's own standing orders to report the police, and that the police are in contravention of their own rules and people's rights if they try and interfere with that. I know that's easier said than done when you're confronted with a burly officer who's threatening to break your camera or to do worse, but people need to exercise a measure of balance in terms of protecting their own integrity and safety, but also standing firm on their rights and perhaps demanding to speak to a superior. As I was saying earlier, there's a reverence for hierarchy, and it's going to be very difficult if an officer is called out up the chain of command for them to defend the indefensible, really. As far as civil society has been concerned, I think they've really done extraordinarily well in the turnaround in terms of highlighting, centralizing, reporting, creating channels, hotlines, and channeling that upwards to the oversight and the management levels through efficient communication, through collaboration of different organizations. I'm thinking specifically of the COVID-19 People's Coalition and the working group where I sit on, and really using a feeling or a sense of crisis to champion much broader interventions. The challenge for us, for civil society, for journalists, for lawyers, and for community members recording these things is to not let the attention and the pressure completely wane when the sense of lockdown and enforcement has dissipated and we start returning to life as normal, and there are more distractions, and this issue becomes just another one in a plethora of issues that we're looking at. I think a unique opportunity has been created in a platform to take what the lockdown has enabled in terms of grassroots upwards accountability from communities and civil society to Parliament, IPID, police management, the Defence Force, to really harness that into the future and to try and instill and get some of the reforms that are desperately needed. And I think those are identifiable, and I think that civil society is well placed to start putting pressure on specific points.
Thank you. I think, so what I've taken from both of your responses is that, one, the Constitution remains supreme even during a national state of disaster, and that active citizens need to continue to work to apply the pressure that's necessary, and that includes civil society. And I'm glad you mentioned the People's Coalition, Daneel, because they've established a reporting hotline, report.org.za, which people can use to access and actually report abuses by security forces. So police, military, private security, any kind of law enforcement, whether you're a victim or whether or not you've just witnessed an abuse. And I think those are very important key takeaways, that even though we can be aware of the risks that come with trying to hold the police accountable, it remains crucial and important to continue to apply the pressure, not only now during the lockdown, but as we look forward to ask for meaningful police accountability and police reform. There's a Marikana post-Marikana report, which the Minister of Police is still sitting on top of. And we wonder why, because those would probably be valuable lessons that the police could have learned from during this period. So I'll say thank you. That was a fantastic discussion. I want to thank you on behalf of the Forge. And as I said, this is one of a series of conversations that they will be hosting over this period. So thank you both for participating. You've made fantastic and valuable contributions.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for having us.